Hello. So I've been reading a book about the origins of Zionism. It's called, let's see, let me try to grab it. It's a book I got in Istanbul in January. My way back from Cairo, had to Canada Airlines screwed me over, left me stranded together with Biden and Canada Airlines stranded me in Egypt, so I had to go use Turkish Airlines to get home, and so I stopped in Istanbul, and I got this book, so it's here, the Lords of the Desert, Britain's Struggle with America to Dominate the Middle East by James Barr. I think that's not the James Barr that's in American politics as far as I know. I think it's a British James Barr. So anyway, it basically shows, like, I had kind of assumed that Israel was Britain's fault because of the Balfour Declaration and the fact that it was their mandate, and and just the British Empire. I figured, like, if anybody would try to create some new colony so that the West could keep a foothold in the Middle East, it would probably be the British, because that's what they did generally. But reading this book, I find that actually the U.S. government was worse than the British. Like, FDR was worse than the British Empire. Like, the British Empire was literally like far more responsive to the needs and the plight of Arabs than the U.S. than FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was, or his vice president Truman, who took over when he died, or Dewey, I guess, was another leading Zionist. Basically, the U.S. government created Israel. They and especially the New York government, and a lot of Zionists in New York City, I guess, they funded the Zionist terrorists. There was I think there was 2 or 3 Zionist terrorist groups. There was I forget what the hell they're called. Anyway, so there was like 2 or 3 main ones, and they were hardcore. Like, they killed hella people, and so, like, as soon as the British liberated, a lot of these are supposedly, liberated all these places from the Nazis and from the, Axis powers. The Zionists turned around and murdered the British. Like, they murdered hundreds of British soldiers, right after and during the British war against Hitler. So I think, the Zionists, I mean, it's hard to know whether they even were against Hitler, because, they, in some way, they're, at least maybe some of them probably see non-Zionist Jews as their primary enemy, especially back then when the vast majority of Jews were anti-Zionists and were, internationalists. So I think that for a lot of them, they probably celebrated, some of them, I think they were bloodthirsty enough that they probably celebrated the Holocaust or parts of it, because it was just well, that's what they get for not being Zionists, that's what they get because even today, a lot of Zionists hate any Jew that doesn't live in Israel, because to not live in Israel, that's a threat to that identity, which says that Israel represents the Jews. But the vast majority of the diaspora still is not in Israel. So they are still, in a way, like the biggest threat to Zionism. Anyway, I mean, the British were bad too, but the British wanted to settle them somewhere else. And like, first of all, like a lot of the ones, like a lot of the Zionists were escaping, not escaping from the Nazis, but this was like, I'm reading now about the part, I mean, probably some of them did escape from the Nazis, and obviously that's very understandable, but it's this idea that they had to take Palestine from the Arabs, you know, like the British tried to like float other ideas and promote other ideas for settling them, but it was just this idea that, well, the Bible promised and God promised this land to the Jews, so fuck the Arabs. Like that was the mindset. And also it's like the white supremacist mindset, because obviously, like, the quote unquote, you know, most of the Zionists, basically Ashkenazim, are basically white. Arabs largely are not white. So, you know, for, you know, majority of the West was basically white supremacist at that time, just as it arguably still is. So they instinctively sided with the white Ashkenazim against the actual Semitic people of Palestine. But yeah, like all the money for those terrorist organizations, the Zionist organizations, or most of the money came from New York and from the rest of the US, but primarily New York, and with the help of the US authorities often, even to the detriment of other nonprofit ventures. You know, they prioritized raising money for the Zionist cause. And they were pretty explicit about that, like they're just doing this to, like the politicians, they were just doing it because they wanted the votes, you know, and they probably wanted campaign funds. So that was a lot of what it was about, just getting that New York vote. Because, you know, controlling New York, that was like a big prize because it's like the big city. And FDR was from New York State. Dewey was in New York, and he was another big Zionist. He was either governor or mayor. I think he was a governor. I mean, the British were still imperialist scum. Like they did some fucked up things, like to, like, you know, because they were trying to limit immigration to Palestine of non-Arabs, because the Arabs demanded it, because they understood, like, these people were not coming to just visit, they were coming to steal their land and take over the country and become the government, create a Jewish state as opposed to, you know, like a secular or Islamic state or anything like that. So the Arabs, in order to mollify their, or the British, in order to mollify the Arabs and the Muslims, and who they still relied on for oil and for other things, they were trying to stop all the illegal immigration of Jews to Palestine. And like they went as far as to go on some immigrant ships and poison their water and food. So I was like, I'm not saying there's good guys in this story. I mean, if there's any good guys, it's just maybe the Arabs themselves. But the British are not good guys, but they still managed to be less vile and disgusting than the US. You know, so I mean, it's a total disgrace. Like, it just shows that, you know, the US government, like if the US government can be used to oppress people abroad, which clearly this is one way that happened, you know, and then that's like, that leads everybody to hate us. Like, there's nothing we gain from this. The only people who gain from it are the people who receive those votes, I guess, and probably more importantly, receive money from deep Zionist pockets, like I think the Rothschild family, or some of the richer of the Rothschilds were Zionists, I think. Could be wrong about that, but I think they did have some wealthy backers. So that, my guess is that was at least as big a impetus as the electorate. But yeah, like, so, and the Zionists really played up the idea that they were doing the same things as the U.S. pioneers did, and the Mayflower, like they still do that. They still always try to, compare them to U.S. history. And of course, in some ways, it's very apt of like genocide and stuff like that. But in other ways, it's not quite as apt, because even the U.S. has arguably not. I'd just say I would rather be like Native American in the U.S. than Palestinian in Gaza. Like a Native American here at least can go anywhere they want, have full rights. They don't get shot for trying to enter their own country, whereas Palestinians every year are shot for trying to enter their own country, Palestine, or quote unquote Israel, to cross over the fence for Nakba Day, and so, etc. So anyway, like, again, it shows like how FDR was trash, and the Democrats have always been, Nazis. Like, they never had any principles. That was always just, because a lot of people look back to FDR. Like, FDR did some good things. He did like the New Deal or whatever, but he probably didn't, even that probably had a lot of issues, but even the good things he did, he basically did because they were demanded, because it was at a time when, there was a very real possibility of socialist revolution, because people were, the working class had become very well educated, and so they were, tired of just dying for the rich scum. So there was going to be, there was a huge socialist movement at that time, and FDR was like a rich guy, dynastic wealth, who basically just, at least did enough to stave off a revolution. And often I think he was open about that as his, at least one of his main motives was just not just to do all these things, but to stave off a revolution, because these things were demanded. Like, stupid people think like, oh yeah, the US has always been just a bunch of right-wing T-billies, and then this great guy FDR, this rich guy, came and said, hey, why don't we have socialism? No, he was like, basically the government was kicking and screaming to give us any social programs at all, and that, arguably includes him. He imprisoned, enslaved Japanese people. Truman, his vice president, who tried to do everything, whatever he thought FDR would do, since FDR died. Which, by the way, he died like right after he rejected some of the Zionist demands. So it's hard to know, because the Zionists killed a lot of people that pissed them off, like British politicians, British judges, they kidnapped and murdered like a lot of high profile people. So, I think they assassinated the British foreign secretary that same year. So I wouldn't even be surprised if they poisoned FDR after he talked to the Saudi king, and he found out that he couldn't just force Zionism on the Arabs, and he started to be a little more nuanced. But anyway, who knows about that? But I'm just saying, like, these people are scum. Like, they're not like, if that's like the furthest left that the U.S. government can go is FDR, then the U.S. government is evil, and the only thing anybody should be doing is trying to end it. If that's what leftism is in the U.S. government, then no thanks. Nope. I know a lot of people love him, love FDR and whatever, but they love an evil person. Who knows? Maybe overall, it's hard to say overall, like, what role this or that person played, but it doesn't matter. Like, this shit is not acceptable. Like if that's acceptable, then what isn't? What is unacceptable? Anything. So like the British also kind of like they were also angling to keep a presence in the Middle East. So their main presence was in Egypt and in Jordan, or no, Egypt and Iraq probably, but especially Egypt. Like they had a lot of troops there and guarding the Suez Canal, and the Egyptians were getting sick of them. There had been a lot, because they were imperialists and they pissed people off. So like the Egyptians wanted them gone, and the US wanted to kind of step in and be the, like, oh yeah, don't trust those British imperialists. You should trust us. We're like the free democratic, yada yada. But that was around the time that the US got deeply invested in Saudi oil. But so both countries were just trying to do anything they could to control the Middle East and especially control the oil. And they, like the actual needs of the people, there's some of the diplomats and stuff like seemed to kind of care, but to a large extent it was just about power, just British power versus American, US power. And it's just, I don't know, it's like pretty amazing, honestly, that like basically the British were trying to stymie Zionism because they knew that it would be a disaster for the Middle East, and nobody would ever, like, there was no, like, even if they put all the entire British army there permanently, they would not be able to keep the peace, because it's just like Arabs are not, they're not cowards like a lot of other, they're not going to like just fold up ever, like they have self-respect, unlike probably a lot of people in the West who just shill for Zionism just because they have no fucking principles or backbone. So like, but yeah, the British were actually trying to stop us. The British were like going all out really to actually help the Arabs, like oddly enough, because they realized that, the Arabs are actually not irrelevant. They actually, occupy most of the Middle East and control a lot of the oil, et cetera, et cetera. So, they wanted to have good relations with everybody, but if they had to piss off a small amount of, terrorists, nationalists to placate, millions of allies, then they were willing to do that. And they just got assassinated by, like, in their hundreds by the Zionists. And again, it was like just right after during and after them quote unquote liberating Europe from the Nazis. That's who the Zionists wiped out, was the British soldiers. They killed, like, I think at least like 300. There's a lot of attacks, like just like every month there were attacks. There's the King Jordan Hotel attack, I think. There was the they attacked the British Officers Club kind of inside the British zone of Palestine. Another funny thing is reading this, like there's all these, like I know some Zionist scum who like, or yeah, basically, at least as far as their Zionism, they are scum. Like that aspect of them is, I don't know. I can never defend these people, but like I know one of them that is the thing he's always saying is like, Palestine is not a real country. Palestinians are not real people. It's all just made up anti-Semitic thing or something like. But when you read the original things, the actual Zionists called it Palestine. They all called it Palestine, and the U.S. people who raised all the money for these terrorists, they called it Palestine. They were the Organization for the Liberation of Palestine. But what that meant was they wanted to liberate it from the British, and I mean, part of it was, like a nuanced issue because they, it was about immigration. So the British were limiting immigration. The Zionists wanted more immigration to Palestine. But at the same time, it was not like the same issue as like, during or before the Holocaust or something like that. Like these were mostly, at least the time I'm reading about, this is all from quote unquote liberated parts of Europe. So these were not people that were in any danger from Hitler or anything like that, but they wanted to go to Palestine and take over or whatever. I mean, like obviously it was a shitty time for a lot of Jews. Like I don't blame, like I definitely do blame like the main Zionists because they were like racist scumbags and arguably they hated Jews. Like if you actually read what they wrote, they were self-hating, and that was part of their justification for wanting to remove themselves from Europe. But in terms of like other people that got pulled into it, sometimes it's like it was a fucked up time. There's a lot of nuance. And at the very least, you can understand why they were pissed at the British for not allowing them in or whatever. But to murder them, to murder hundreds of soldiers when not even, like they're not even stopping immigration. I mean, they probably did stop immigration during and before the Holocaust. And in that case, that's evil. Like, I mean, everybody, like everybody stopped the Jews and gypsies and, like every country had so much controls on immigration that you could almost say every country on earth killed those Jews because they refused to let them in. So yeah, there's not really good guys in this story except I think the Arabs, or at least, they weren't bad. They were the victims in this. But yeah, the US was terrible. The Democrats were terrible. The Republicans were also terrible because, the Democrats and Republicans just were like fiercely competing to like suck off the Zionist, to like show for the Zionists the most. And, Truman and Dewey were, doing dueling press releases, public statements to that effect. And so yeah, it's just disgusting, like the US, like I still believe in the Bill of Rights. I still believe in the ideas that were, that a lot of people, hope to establish in this country, like from 1776 and before. But obviously, like when you have a government that's helping imperialism or helping colonialism and white supremacy just for votes and for money and stuff, it's clearly the opposite of anything our country was supposed to be. And it's just amazing how many Zionists come here and they enjoy the full rights that our Constitution gave to them, and they would never give that to Arabs who are the actual like native population of Palestine. Like that's what I say. Like because I know people like this, like that are, rabid Zionists and will shill for basically everything Israel does, and yet they live in the U.S. and they demand equality and they demand justice here, and they don't even care of the hypocrisy, because that's the thing. Hypocrites, they're hypocrites all the time, so it doesn't faze them. Like that's just how they are. So like, it's basically a disease that is destroying our country. And I think there were some people from early on that saw what was going on and saw the problems, but apparently the British Empire saw it a lot better, like they basically predicted everything that has happened in the Middle East since then. And they saw that, yeah, if the US does this and creates this, basically Jewish state there, there's just going to be endless fighting there and endless instability, which I had thought that was the British plan based on like the Balfour Declaration. But even the Balfour Declaration like was pretty limited in its scope. You know, it said like, I mean, it was still fucked up, but it said like it called for Arab rights to be respected as well, etc. And so, you know, the British kind of like went back and forth on some of that, but yeah, the British imperialists, you know, they were pretty evil, but they were not as bad as the US. So it's just funny that like the supposed constitutional democracy, once it finally gets into the world, into the global stage, it's literally worse than the fucking worst empire in the world. Like, it's disgusting. Anyway, so New York was a mistake. I really think we should just like give Manhattan back to the fucking Dutch. Cause like what, I mean, nothing good. Like, I don't know. There's some good people in New York, but I don't know. I mean, just the whole US government is trash. But yeah, New York has definitely been the source of a lot of the worst, be it Trump or even some like people like Bernie that try to give people hope and then they're just as bad fucking shills as anybody. So I don't know. I'm sure there's good people in New York. I hope all the Zionists and Nazis fucking, I don't know, fall into the ocean or something. But either way, like the U.S. citizens should not tolerate this. You know, they shouldn't have tolerated it at the time. That showed what, you know, like garbage of a country we had become by that time. And, you know, but now it's like, it's never too late to fucking actually try to be constitutional and actually try to be, you know, a democratic republic instead of a fucking empire. So yeah, like, fuck the Democrats and the Republicans and the US government and the British government. But yeah, I guess I should apologize to the British just for the fact that I have really always assumed that they created Israel. But more what happened was the British way of looking at things, the imperialist mindset was somehow transferred like to the US. Like the US, especially the founders of the CIA, like the OSS, they were super like Anglophiles. So they were worse they modeled their policy off the British Empire, but they were worse than the British, or at least worse than the British at that time. Maybe they were like what the British had been in like the 1800s or something. So, you know, like, I'm not absolving the British, but yeah, the US was, and just like with the IRA, you know, like the IRA was funded by New York. You know, so many people were murdered in Ireland and in Britain by US money, you know, like Irish Americans who just, you know, like, just like, oh yeah, here, you know, take some guns. Like, I mean, it's easy to like support some war somewhere far away and somebody tells you like it's somehow noble and great and whatever. And just without even actually looking into it and finding out like, oh, the IRA actually mostly kills their fellow Catholics and mostly, you know, like, I mean, I'm not saying the IRA is as bad as the Zionists, but it's funny that the IRA tries to like position itself as the comrades of the Palestinians, because the IRA is more like the Zionists, because they, you know, they're all about historical racial legitimacy, you know, like that Ireland is Irish, so people of British ancestry that have lived there for 400 years have less legitimacy and yada yada. That's the same mindset as the Zionists, you know, and ironically, like the Unionists, the Ulster Unionists in Ireland are more, in some ways, are closer in that sense to the Palestinians, because what they want is just democracy. But but a lot of them are just so stupid that they support Zionism conceptually, even though it's like the opposite concept. So again, no good guys, but anyway, it looks like my phone is going to delete this for like a week again, like last time. So that's great. It seems like, yeah, it just went over 30 minutes and then it says something like, I forget what the message is, but then it just deletes it and then it randomly reappears like a week later. So Samsung, yeah, fuck Samsung also. All right, so global revolution, eco-socialism, solidarity.